Distressing were the everyday scenes now witnessed. Thousands and tens of thousands of the Portuguese population crowded the narrow roads leading to Lisbon, frequently mixing with and impeding the retreating army. These miserables, having buried their valuables and left their homes, were staggering along carrying their children and heavy burdens. To complete the misery of all, rain fell heavily day after day, so that the roads, always bad, were, by the passage of artillery, baggage and cavalry, made nearly impassable. Several men, not being able to keep up, were taken prisoners. That's Fusilier John Cooper of the 7th Royal Fusiliers, and he's talking about the aftermath of the Battle of Busaco, which was fought on September the 27th, 1810. As you'll recall from last month's podcast episode, Wellington and the Allied army had stood on that steep ridge at Busaco and dished out a hiding to the French invasion force under Marshal Massena. It had been more of a metaphorical stiff jab than a devastating right cross. But now the French had outflanked the Redcoats and the British were falling back towards Lisbon. Many expected to board boats and head back to England with their tail between their legs. But their Commander-in-Chief Wellington wasn't that sort of man. He had bags of testicular fortitude coupled with an overabundance of tactical and strategic ability. Like any good chess player, he was one step ahead of the enemy. Since 1809, Wellington had been working on a strategy to defeat the third French invasion of Portugal. That strategy entailed rebuilding, re-equipping and training the Portuguese army. That had worked, and they'd done sterling work at Busaco and could now be counted as the equal of their British comrade in arms. The second part of his strategy had been a scorched earth policy that demanded the Portuguese leave their homes, burn their crops, kill their cattle and retreat to Lisbon, leaving the country behind them a desolate wasteland for the invaders. The aftermath of that strategy is what Cooper was talking about at the top of the show. The final element of Wellington's plan was one that had been kept a secret from the entire army and population of Portugal. It was the epic building project that was known as the Lines of Torres Vedras, a ring of fortifications across the hills that blocked the roads to Lisbon, one of the greatest military engineering feats ever seen in Europe. A young subaltern, Charles Leslie, saw the fortifications for the first time from a boat heading towards Lisbon. He recalled, "About a league below Villafranca we observed a considerable range of heights on the right bank of the Tagus, rising from the town of Alhandra and stretching towards the west, on which appeared batteries and embankments. I inquired of the boatman what these were. He answered, 'Oh, sir, those are the lines.' This was an enigma to us, but my friend, the aide-de-camp, solved the mystery. He said, 'That is the position Lord Wellington is now falling back upon, and where he means to meet the enemy.' This threw a new light upon us. Everyone wondered and became animated. Each one seemed to take an intense interest in examining the little we could see of such works as we swept along. It was unanimously agreed that our valiant commander had in this displayed the utmost sagacity. His secret had been well kept. None of us had ever heard of these preparations. I'm joined on the show today by the excellent Dr. Mark Thompson. He's the author of a number of Peninsular War books, including Wellington's Engineers and Wellington's Favourite Engineer. He really is a world-class expert, and I highly recommend his books. I've even got a copy of this one, Wellington's Engineers. He's also involved in the Lines of Torres Vedras, the Friends of the Lines of Torres Vedras, whose aim is to raise awareness about the lines and to help to conserve what remains of them. A worthy set of goals. There's a link to the website in the show notes. Mark started our conversation by giving me a full background to the development of the Lines of Torres Vedras.
So 1809, Napoleon fights the Austrians and beats them at the Battle of Wagram. And coming out of that armistice, Napoleon declared he was going to bring 100,000 troops himself into the Iberian Peninsula and throw out the British army that's there. So this is kind of the very brief background as to what the Lines of Torres Vedras about. At this point, there was probably 250,000 French troops in the Iberian Peninsula. Wellington had an army of roughly 30,000 British, backed up by roughly 30,000 Portuguese, and a larger number of Spanish, but they were split all over the country. There wasn't a coherent force there. So Wellington was massively outnumbered, and there was no way he could stand against a substantial French army invading Portugal. The Lines of Torres Vedras was his reaction to that, which was a secure base, which would be impregnable to attack, but would allow him to remain in the country and launch subsequent campaigns.
So when did he have that idea? Have we been able to nail this down? And was it just Wellington's idea? I think I read in your book that maybe there may have been earlier reports that he drew upon.
Yeah, okay. Answering them in that order. Wellington went to Portugal, to Lisbon in October 1809 to look at it. And the memorandum he wrote, 20th of October 1809, laying out the groundwork for the lines, was written then. But he had clearly been thinking about this for a lot longer. He was there in 1808, as we've already said, and he was actually based around the town of Torres Vedras for a number of weeks before the French army left the country. So he'd had a chance then to look at the terrain and build a bit of understanding from it. March 1809, just before he comes back out to the Peninsular, he actually writes to the government and says, I am absolutely sure I can defend Portugal if the French send an army below 100,000 troops. So Wellington had obviously been thinking about how to do this for a while. His plan was October 1809. Answering the second part of your question, the earliest signs of fortifications that have been identified around Lisbon is 2,000 years ago. So this wasn't a new idea to build on some very big hills. So not rocket science. Coming back a bit closer to home, General Stuart was out there in 1797 assisting the Portuguese resisting Spanish attacks. And he suggested you could defend the area to the north of Lisbon. Junot, the French commander who invaded in 1807, his chief engineer wrote comprehensive detailed reports on how to defend the river and the inland of Lisbon. One of the gentlemen working for him was a Portuguese engineer called José Maria das Neves Costa, who, after the French were evicted, continued his work and wrote an even more detailed proposal on how to defend the area. Now, the commonality in all these is the hills don't move. So everybody was broadly saying, you need to use these hills. So Wellington came up with a different way of doing it, but the general idea was not new at all.
And what was Wellington's way then? What is it he proposed?
Okay, the main difference between just keeping into the immediate sort of period, what the French engineer Vincent and the Portuguese engineer Neves Costa were proposing was using the hills as defensive positions, sort of temporary defensive positions to slow down an invading force. The difference Wellington put into it was actually to put physical defences on key points on these hills to slow down or hopefully stop any French invasion. So different interpretations on how to use the terrain to the north of Lisbon.
And so he put forward this proposal. When did work start on the lines?
Wellington's proposal was the 20th of October 1809. The first work started probably within about 10 days of that. By the first days in November, the first forts were being prepared. But one thing I must say, Wellington's plan, and we maybe get an opportunity to talk about this later, was more of an outline of what needed to be done rather than details. But what that original plan did say was, I need you to fortify 3 areas. One was around the town of Torres Vedras itself. One was around another town called Sobral. And the third was around San Julian on the Tagus estuary. The first 2 were designed to slow the French down, but there being a defensive line behind that. The third one was Wellington's embarkation point if it all went horribly wrong. So these 3 areas were started around November 1809. A lot of the other work wasn't actually started until January, February 1810, with a lot, but not all, complete by October 1810, when the British and the French all arrived at the lines.
And I mean, I guess it gives a sense of Wellington's foresight, in that at this point, I think I'm right in saying the British army was still sort of on the Spanish-Portuguese border, right? Sort of around Badajoz and around there. So he was thinking well in advance here, is that right?
Yeah, certainly in the autumn of 1809, Wellington was about Badajoz. This was the back end of the Talavera campaign, which the British sort of claim was a great victory. But I think the truth is a bit more nuanced, shall we say. Wellington was lucky to get back to the border, fought well, but the first experience of working with the Spanish, I don't think was to anybody's satisfaction. And that, I'm sure, spurred Wellington's desire to look for alternative ways of defending against the French. At that point in time, it clearly wasn't going to be by working with the Spanish and defeating them on battlefields. A plan B was needed.
And in one of the recent episodes of the podcast, we've looked at the Battle of Busaco. Could you give us a bit of an idea, a bit of a sort of engineering perspective in how involved the engineers were there in making that battlefield in a way that allowed the British to defend it even better than the natural barrier it was? Can you give us an idea of what the engineers did there and how that helped play a part in Britain's victory?
Yeah, okay. I'm sure some people are listening to this, and I don't know whether you have, but if you've been to Busaco, it's another big hill, to put it mildly. Again, maybe going back to Wellington's foresight, working with the engineers, they were started in the beginning of 1810, January, February 1810. There were engineers out surveying the whole of that area of the country. They were looking at bridges, they were mining bridges, they were blowing some bridges 9 months before the battle. Wellington's intent was really to channel the French where he wanted them to go. His biggest problem was he didn't know whether they would travel north or south of the Mondego. The obvious sensible route was south of the Mondego because that's where the best roads were. Unfortunately, the French didn't play cricket on this and decided they'd go north of the Mondego. And there's some interesting current debates going on about whether that was due to the poor Lopez maps he was using, which is, shall we say, the traditional view, or whether there were a more nuanced view, which was if he went north of the Mondego, he could sack Viseu and then move down and sack Coimbra to get food and resources for moving on. So that's a debate that's still running around. Anyway, back to the question. The work the engineers did on the battlefield itself, that they did some work to improve the lateral road running behind the British line to allow improved movement of Allied troops. There were some defensive earthworks built in the vicinity of the convent, and certainly a day or two before they were working 24/7 to get some defensive positions there, just to give a bit of cover for particularly the pickets on the line. The other thing that was going on in the days immediately before the battle is that there was a senior Royal Engineer doing a detailed survey of the Mondego around Coimbra and right down to the sea, and noting every possible crossing point, again leaving Wellington's options. So the engineers were doing a lot of work to support what was going on. It again, to be fair, it should also be said that the Quartermaster General's Department were doing similar amounts of work, whilst it might not have been fully joined up. Their officers were also doing a lot of work in the area, surveying and reconnaissance, and there were exceedingly detailed reports available for the British Army on how they would retreat from the position of Busaco. So lots of planning went on. This wasn't a snap decision to use that ridge. Final comment before I let you get a word in is there was a similar ridge just to the south of the Mondego, which was also had been identified, so that had the French gone south of the Mondego, there was, well, basically the Busaco Ridge continues south of the Mondego, and a few miles further in front of that there's another ridge called the Serra de Moita. So all these had been looked at with potential places to stop the French.
And do you think at this point, did the prescribed wisdom, like most people assume Wellington's plan was just to bloody the noses of the French and pull back to the lines of Torres Vedras? But do you think maybe he actually hoped he could stop and turn them around there at Busaco until he was outflanked? Do you think he actually hoped he could push them right back from there?
It's an interesting question. Again, it's a little bit topical at the moment because there have been some other books on the area, but books like Kent and White's, which I'll give you the details if you want later. But I think Wellington intended to try and stop them there because it was a very, very strong position. The route that the French took round the British left flank, Wellington was fully aware it was there. So it wasn't a surprise to him that road was used. Wellington made arrangements for that route to be covered to stop the French going. He only asked for a couple of Portuguese militia regiments to do this. Murphy's Law, the order didn't get through till late. They didn't get there in time. So Wellington had a convenient target to blame for the French manoeuvring activity. It was clearly the Portuguese fault for 2 militia regiments not stopping the French army. But why do I think he intended to stop it there? Well, it's the fact, if you look at what happened immediately after the Battle of Busaco, having said there were detailed plans to withdraw the army, the whole thing just looks terribly hurried when you see what's happened over the coming few days. The inhabitants of Coimbra got about 24 hours notice to leave, and you read the diaries and they all talk about the roads full of civilians blocking it up without the right equipment for moving, people in inappropriate sort of clothes. Excuse me. There was significant amounts of stores destroyed at Coimbra itself and in some of the towns just to the south of it. It doesn't give the feel that this whole thing had been thought out in detail and Wellington knew he was going to give them a bloody nose and then immediately retire. They were destroying huge amounts of resources, which were just behind the British lines. So it doesn't add up in the same way that Wellington's Burgos campaign doesn't add up if you look at what was going on at the time.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, that is interesting. I think you make a really valid point there. I'm sure some of the listeners will have their own opinions on that, but it definitely makes sense to me. And then, so moving on, after the Battle of Busaco, the British and the Portuguese withdraw back to the lines of Torres Vedras. Can you give us a sense? They've had now by this point, about a year to work on these things. Can you give us an example of the scale of them, what was involved in building them, and when the British and Portuguese retired into them, how they looked, and how many, a ballpark figure of how many redouts and that sort of thing, redouts?
Yeah, okay. I'm going to just start by using the figures in John Jones, but I will later on say that they're not right.
And just to clarify for listeners, John Jones was an engineer who was involved in the project, correct?
My apologies. John Jones wrote the definitive works on the sieges in the Peninsular War, and the Lines of Torres Vedras are covered in the later third edition of that works. The numbers he used, and I said they're broadly correct, that there was something like 152 forts. That's the number John Jones had. Within those forts, there's something again in the region of 630 guns. And if every one of those forts was manned as expected, you're potentially having 40,000 troops in the forts. Now, particularly that last number is really misleading because the intention was never to occupy all 3 defensive lines. I should go back and talk about defensive lines first. The positions by the time the French arrived had 2 extensive lines running from the River Tagus across to the Atlantic. The first line, as it became, was about 29 miles, 47 kilometers long. The second line was 24 miles, 39 kilometers long. So these are extensive lines, a lot of it on substantial hills. A substantial hill in this context is anything up to 400 meters high, so 1,200 feet. But there's row upon row upon row of them with deep valleys in between. So crossing this area is exceedingly hard work. The third line, which was part of Wellington's original plans, was around the embarkation point at St. Julien itself. Eventually, from December 1810, a fourth line was built on the south banks of the River Tagus to stop the enemy taking the banks, because from that point they could shell all the British shipping opposite Lisbon. So going back to my point about the troops, around 40,000 would be needed to occupy all these lines, but it was never the intention to occupy them all at once. So you would occupy the forts in the first line, and when that was breached, the troops would fall back to the second line, and when that was breached, they would fall back to the third line. So the reality is that the number of troops ever needed to man the forts was probably more like 10 to 15,000 than some of the larger numbers that you see mentioned.
And maybe this is a bit of an ignorant question, but was this form of defence common in this era? Is it something that had been done much elsewhere? I haven't read much about other armies or in other campaigns building sort of defensive lines like that.
I think the answer is no, it wasn't, and pretty much to a man. Excuse me again. Nobody thought it would work. That includes the engineers who spent a year building it. People just didn't seem to be able to sort of see the bigger picture that Wellington had in his mind. So this was unusual, but it was also unusual to have a position where you could anchor one end of the line on an ocean and the other end on a river that at places was a mile or more wide. So the circumstances were fairly unique, which I'm sure is why it was used here and not anywhere else. Because of the nature of the terrain, I say this wasn't a constant range of hills across. The 152 forts, were individual forts. They're individually designed for a point. It had a purpose to, cover a road or cover a valley. In between them, there wasn't necessarily a continuous line of fortification. So they're called the lines, but they weren't. They were individual forts. But in between the forts, there would be scarping in some places. There could be ditches. There could be abattis, building defences by cutting down trees. They cut down something like 50,000 trees. So all the cork trees and the olive trees in the area of Lisbon were cut down to make sort of impenetrable barriers. So individual forts, but all the weak areas that then had substantial additional work done to make them really difficult to get past them.
And can you explain the term scarping?
Scarping is effectively making a hillside vertical, that very simplistic view. So some of these hills, which I say are going up to potentially 1,000 feet, they will be drilling and using explosives to blow off the face of the hillside to leave a near vertical face, maybe only about 8 to 10 feet. But it means, then you're back to scaling ladders if you want to even climb up the hillsides. So in the key areas, particularly around the Tagus estuary end, on the first line around Alhandra, there was about 2 miles of scarping there. And then later, really after the French had arrived, they started scarping the second line. And at the Atlantic end of the second line, the abattis built by cutting down trees was something like 15 kilometers long. There was a lot of work done to make it difficult to cross this terrain.
And am I right in saying that regular British troops weren't used to man these forts, at least not generally? It was mainly Portuguese militia with the British and Portuguese sort of field army ready to manoeuvre to any point where the French broke through. Is that the case?
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely right. And it's the thing that I find surprising today, that Wellington's commanders, including the senior ones, Wellington's engineers, just didn't seem to get this. Wellington's plan was always to use militia troops and levy troops to man the forts and to keep his army essentially concentrated to manoeuvre against any perceived threat. So in very simple terms, when they arrived at the lines in October 1810, Wellington plonked his army in the middle of the front line as the most sensible place to keep it, to be able to react to anything that went on.
And do we know when the French arrived? What were their thoughts? Do we have many sources that say how the French felt about the lines? Did they think, oh, this is nothing, this will be easy, or were they very, very concerned at what they saw?
Yeah, and there's a number of sort of interpretations of what's going on. Some of the best sort of and most accessible sort of comments are in Pelé's sort of journal of the campaign, but there are others. I think that the French view is interesting in that there's a classic account, and it's probably apocryphal, about Massena blowing his top when he first rides down to look at the lines and saying to his French advisors and to his Portuguese advisors, "Why haven't you told me about this?" And the answer being, "Well, we didn't know he'd built forts on the top." And Massena's response was along the lines of, "Yeah, but he didn't build the hills, did he?" So, I mean, that's tended the apocryphal view on what the view was. They knew before they got there that defences were being built. Possibly many weeks before, they were getting rumours something was being done there. They underestimated the scale of the work, and that really isn't surprising because it was an enormous piece of work. And I think that's what shocked them when they arrived in front of the lines, was not that there were defences on the top. It was just a continuous line of substantial defences as far as the eye could see. So I think there was, really from Massena downwards, there was a huge shock and a huge demoralisation. The French troops were expecting to walk into Lisbon, the British evacuate, and then they could spend the next few weeks stripping Lisbon of everything worth having. So the actual morale effect on the troops of suddenly realising they're stuck in the cold and rain in October in Portugal with no obvious route forward probably had a significant effect on how they felt. Some of the French generals and marshals were all for giving it a go and making a substantial attack on the common view, even in the British army, that if you concentrate in one place and put in some diversionary attacks, you're bound to get through. But in the end, Massena decided that he did not have the troops to break through, and he probably didn't.
And I mean, I don't know, this may be outside of your area of expertise, but why didn't he try? And if he and why didn't he? How did he then explain that to Napoleon? Because presumably this was an army of thrusters. These were guys who would throw as many men as they had to into the attack. It seems strange to me that they didn't even try.
Yeah, I think maybe going back to something I said several minutes ago, Napoleon's original intention when he said he was coming personally was, I'm going to bring an army of 100,000 with me. When he decided that his heir to the throne was more important and gave the job to Massena, Massena's army probably started at around 80,000, just generalization again. By the time he arrived in front of the lines, having left troops along the way, he probably didn't have more than about 60,000. Even at that point, Wellington probably had more disposable troops behind the line than the French had. The French were already in a difficult situation. Supplies weren't as scarce as they were supposed to be, but they were already worried about the supply situation. And the defences looked absolutely impregnable. The first line at this point had defences at the Tagus end, almost nothing in the middle, and a small amount at the Atlantic end. Wellington placed his army in the middle and then pretty much put the whole of his artillery, so you're talking potentially 70 guns, into earthwork redoubts, filling the gap in the middle. So I think a lot of the French officers were looking at this and thinking, we might get through, but it's a bloodbath. And even then they knew that if we get through, the first line wasn't the strongest line. The strongest line was the second. So if we get through this, we've got to do the same thing again, 6 or 7 miles further south. And I think, overall, I think they were just overwhelmed at the scale. And Massena's view, without reinforcements, he could not get through and have a viable army by the time he got to Lisbon.
Yeah, I suppose that does make sense. And then, so what happens at this point? So essentially then, the British and Portuguese have withdrawn into the lines, the French turn up. What happens next?
Okay, well, I think really, as you've just suggested, the first attempts were to probe the lines and see what was going on. So there was a lot of reconnaissance done, riding along, trying to understand the scale of them. Really, I do have to say that the attempts were quite half-hearted. There was only 2 significant attempts made. Neither of them contained more than about 2,000 troops. And both of them, to me, felt like he was just sort of poking them with a stick to see what the response was. I mean, in one case around Sobral, the attack was made by the 4th Battalion, newly arrived, of a regiment. These were raw recruits. It felt more like blooding some troops than a serious attempt to break through the lines. But 2 or 3 attempts were made over the first week or 10 days, none of them on any scale. And then Massena very much decided that, I'm going to have to wait for reinforcements. One of the things that probably isn't clear from the general views of the lines, Massena didn't sit in front of the lines from October through to March 1811. 4 weeks roughly after he arrived, he pulled his troops back to Santarem. So you're talking 40, 50 miles away from the lines. There were some closer, but within 4 weeks, the main French army had pulled back quite away from the lines. And a lot of this was about getting supplies. So really from the middle of November through to the beginning of March 1811, when the French left, the French weren't in front of the lines and the lines weren't actually occupied. There was a token force there, but the British army and the British and Portuguese, the Allied army, was actually in front of the lines as well. So it didn't quite work out the classic way of, they stood in front staring at them for 5 months. It was a slightly different picture.
Because in your head, you imagine almost a sort of World War I situation with, 2 lots of troops staring at each other over no man's land, but it was nothing like that.
The first few days were, but that rapidly sort of changed. The weather at this time was utterly appalling. So I think finding shelter and food became the priority for everybody. Not a problem for the Allies getting supplies in through Lisbon. More of a problem for the French, who became more and more brutal in their methods of finding foodstuffs in the Portuguese countryside at that time.
And that was eventually their downfall, right? And that's that lack of food and lack of supplies, and that's why they ended up essentially withdrawing without really putting up much of a fight. Is that right?
Again, all these things, there's so many different interpretations on it. The classic interpretation is that, but you will certainly see in many, many diaries at the time, people commenting on how much food still seemed to be available to the French army. Certainly through to the end of the year, that was the case. It got harder after that, and more and more of the French army spent their whole time searching for food than being in a position to defend against a surprise attack from the Allies. So I think by March, I think the decision was made in February 1811, and Massena met with his senior officers, and the decision was made that since they'd heard nothing from anybody, there was no sign of any reinforcements, they really were left with no choice but to retreat.
So the Lines of Torres Vedras had fulfilled their duty by this point. The French had only been in front of them for a few weeks, and they were never to see them again. Is that right?
Yep.
So was it worth it, I guess, is my question.
Well, I think without a doubt it is, because obviously the other question is, if they weren't there, what would have happened? If they weren't there, then Wellington would have eventually been forced to stand and fight a battle. His odds of winning would have been much better by then because of the general wear and tear on the French army. But as he kept being reminded by the British government, you have the only British army in existence, please don't break it. And this was a message that came through every 2 or 3 weeks. Just in case you've forgotten since I last mentioned it, don't break the army, please. So, Wellington's view all the way through was, if I can beat the French without fighting them, that was my choice. And there's a number of long letters home where he discusses the options for attacking the French. I'm stronger. My troops are in better condition. The French are disorganized because of going looking for food, etc. But no, I think I'll just keep waiting. So they thought about it. The British officers, I think, generally were pretty disgusted that he wouldn't go out and fight them. But Wellington was looking to win the campaign, not win a battle. And they are very, very different. He could achieve his aim by just sitting tight and waiting and see what the French did. As it happened, Wellington had just made up the decision that he was actually going to attack them. He was waiting for reinforcements, which were due in February, which were delayed and didn't turn up until the first days of March. And pretty much to the day, Wellington's reinforcements arrived the same day that Massena's retreat started. So had Massena waited another week, it could all have been very different.
So with the whole building of the Lines of Torres Vedras and essentially the success of the campaign around them, what does this tell us about Wellington? What does this tell us about his character and what sort of general he was?
Well, I think there's a couple of things, and I mean, in the same way Napoleon does, he does tend to get up to sort of cult status with many people. But I think there's two major things I take out of what Wellington did there. The first is his planning and attention to detail, in that he'd been thinking of this probably since 2008, a year before he actually starts seriously looking at it. So he'd been mulling this around for a while, and he was always known for his organizational bent. And I think this is just an example of it, that he thought about what he wanted and then he did it, which is what the French and the Portuguese didn't. So I think attention to detail and planning is one thing. The second thing is sticking to your plan when you're convinced it's right. Now, that includes not very politely telling the government to go away when they kept trying to second guess what he was doing. But I think more importantly, his refusal to go to support of Almeida and Ciudad Rodrigo during the French invasion, because he was just not strong enough to fight the French at that point. He stuck to his plan. When he got to the lines, he stuck to his plan again in declining to go out and fight a battle, even when it got to a point where he would be quite certain to win it because the French army had degraded so much. But no, he had a plan, which was wear them out and beat them without a battle, and he stuck to it. Again, something he'd done from about May 1810 through to March 1811. So again, sticking to that plan for 9 months. And I think that they're the 2 points that come out most to me in this campaign.
I think Bruce Lee would call it the art of fighting without fighting.
Yeah, I'm sure Sun Tzu will have some eminently quotable sort of maxim for this as well. But again, Sun Tzu does say this. If you can beat the enemy without fighting them, that is the greatest victory you can have. And I mean, there's some wonderful quotes around about this. I mean, he says going to look for it. This is a very recent one. If a battle had taken place in which one side lost 30,000 and the other a few hundreds, it would echo down the pages of history as the greatest victory ever won. This was the 8th Duke of Wellington said this, so that's quite recent. Going back 100 years or so, Charles Ullman, I'm trying to do this from memory, says something like, the high point of the French Empire came on a wet and windy hillside outside Sobral in October 1810. It was a small part, but in 1810, this was the only place where the French had lost in Europe for some time. Small start, and it played a part in the wider defeat.
So you've been involved with the lines, studying them and looking at them for quite some time. I believe there are still a lot for people to go and visit. I feel this feels a good point to move forward and look at that. What's still there, and what can people go and see?
Okay, there are something like 104 of the 150 forts, and I must tell you it's not 150 in a second. There are still something like 104 forts in existence. Different stages of existence, from you can see the lump on the ground through to some fairly significantly restored ones where particularly all the stone facing on the walls is in place. A lot of visitor centres there now, so you can go around and you can see very modern, what they call interpretation centres. So when I first went there, which is 15 years ago, it was all a bit bleak and you needed a good map and a lot of patience to find anything. There are now a number of tourist guides, trail guides. The signposting is fantastic now. There are car parks, there are places to eat. So it's a very, very different ball game. It's a great part of the world to explore anyway. It's very picturesque. Flora and fauna is good. The restaurants are fantastic. If you like it, Lisbon nightlife is good. And there's lots of military history to see. So absolutely worth going and having a visit. The Portuguese have very much in the last 10 or 15 years, I think, come to terms with what they have and the potential of it. They were made national monuments in their entirety, 2015, I think it was. So they are now protected in the same way as monuments are in the UK, which is you still try to keep people off them, but there are now things you can do to dissuade people. They also now officially have a Lines of Torres Vedras Day, which is the 20th of October every year, which is the date when Wellington issued his memorandum on the lines. So there's a lot more interest on what's going on out there now. There's certainly lots to see. Quite often more than you'll see on the battlefield, I would say, but maybe I'm a little bit biased. Just going back to a point I've picked up twice and not said anything. The generally accepted number of forts in existence was 152, which is the number in John Jones's book, which tends to be where everybody goes back to. His first publication was 1829, so still very recent. When you actually look on the ground and read some of the letters of the time, that number rapidly goes up to 169, because some of the forts were in multiple parts. So fort number 1 actually had an A, B, C, D, E, F and G, as did Fort 5. There's a number that had parts A and B. These are modern numbering system rather than then. So you can get up to 169 forts north of the Tagus. There's then quite a bit of evidence that I found probably about a dozen unnumbered forts on top of those. So up now to about 190. There was another 21 to the south of the Tagus in what they call the fourth line today. So that takes us up to 210. And then there's the other line of defences that Jones doesn't mention whatsoever, which is a line of defences built around the perimeter of the city itself, which adds another 29 forts. So in total, the number's more like 250 than 150. But go back to the point, the ones you can see, there are about 100 you can go around, and there are about 35 that are formally maintained by the local municipalities. So that there is still lots to see there.
Brilliant. And if people go to the Friends of the Lines of Torres Vedras website, is all the information there about which forts they can visit and all of that sort of stuff?
Yeah, what you'll find on the Friends website is a complete list of all the forts with information on each of it. That's as they existed 200 years ago. You will find links on the website to local organisations. There are a couple of guides you can download direct from the website. There's a small handy one, and then there's a much larger one that's got if you like itineraries for day trips in the area, and that has maps and things on. So there is actually lots of information to be had now on what to do when you're out there. And if somebody wants to know something that they can't find the answer to, there is a contact page on the Friends website, or ask a question on Facebook, or ask a question on Twitter, and we will do our best to help you out. It is absolutely worth a visit, because you can start the day with a good breakfast, you can have a good long lunch somewhere, and then go out for dinner in an evening and see some real history you can touch. in the rest of the day.
Yeah, it sounds like the sort of place where a geek like me could take their wife and get away with it because there's enough other stuff for them to do.
I've done some bits out there with my wife, and you can make it something enjoyable for the family. It doesn't have to be tedious. But I mean, the good thing in the last 10 years is I think there are now 7 interpretation centres opened by the Portuguese municipalities across the area of the lines. So there is a lot of new stuff. A lot of it's hands-on. So I won't say it's completely kid-friendly, but it's kid interesting at least. So you can take your family out there and it not be a complete sort of boring day.
And so the Lines of Torres Vedras achieved their goal. The third French invasion was well and truly repulsed. You could argue it was one of Wellington's greatest victories, a victory achieved with very few combat casualties. I'll be covering the lines in more detail in the next volume of my History of the Peninsular War book series. Here's volume 1. This is available on Amazon as both a Kindle and a paperback. So if you want to support the show, then purchasing this will really help. Just search for the Military History Geek's Guide to the Peninsular War. Next month, the podcast will return with a deep dive into the punishing Battle of Fuentes de Oñoro. Join me as Marshal Massena attempts to lead his army back into Portugal to relieve the besieged city of Almeida in May 1811. As you can imagine, Wellington's having none of that, and quite a scrap ensues. It's a close-run battle. Will Massena get turned around, or will the Redcoats have to withdraw once again? Join me then to find out.